I was out the other day on my top mount setup and I was having a blast. The pumping felt effortless, like the board was doing half the work for me. And then I switched over to a lower bracket setup and I realized that I have to put more ankle work to keep the pump going. Both setups have already gone through bushing adjustments to make them feel almost equally soft, but even then, the effort required just wasn't the same. So what's actually causing that? To find out, I decided to set up a test bed and see what's actually happening under our feet. Okay, so this is the rig, and as you can see over here, I've clamped down the kingpin. So the kingpin is connected through this arm and with this suction cup, so it doesn't move. With this alignment on the screen and of course on this screen as well, as much as possible I try to keep it center. Then I will draw lines with these rulers over here to measure when the board is flat and when the board is lean. So this way the board can move freely, the center still stays there. I'm going to run two experiments. First, a top mount lab setup that's excessively high to act as our magnifying glass for the physics. Then, a typical bracket setup that I would normally use. Now, full disclosure, this isn't a NASA-grade laboratory or even close to that. I basically locked the kingpins on a tabletop to visualize the physics, so there's some margin of error here. I also know that in the real world, the bushings, the pivot friction, the deck flex, and a lot of other things play a huge role in how a board feels. So with all that said, let's look at the first variable, effective width. So I put this center line over the table to act as our fixed pivot axis. Now watch what happens when I lean the top mount. The deck doesn't just tip, it swings out, away from that line. This is effective width. Because the deck is higher, it travels further out as I lean, which makes it easier to get a response from the trucks, especially when you're pumping. On the bracket setup, that movement stays much tighter, so I get less out of the same input. So you can see here that the setup is now aligned with what it was when it was high. It's the same deck, and when it leans, it doesn't really make much of a difference. The deck stays much closer to the axis, and that also directly affects the effective width. So even though the lean movement looks similar, I'm getting less width out of the bracket setup. Now let's talk about setup height. Mostly, we refer to setup height based on deck from ground. This metric is mainly for pushing. For pumping, we should be looking at the geometry height, which is the height of your feet relative to the wheel axles. And even more than that, geometry height is dynamic. So as you can see, the edges of the deck goes lower than the axles on this bracket setup. Once the edge of the deck get to the same horizontal plane as the axle, your mechanical advantage drops off significantly. I used to think that if a board feels dead, you can just swap it with softer bushings to fix it. But as the trucks start to level with the edge of the deck, the response begins to drop off. And you lose some of that rebound snap right when you need it most. Of course, you won't usually lean this far in the real pump, but this is what happens as you get closer to that point. This is why some setups feel fine when you're wiggle pumping, but when you go into a deeper, wider pump, your rebound response starts to drop off, and you end up doing more of the work yourself to keep the pump going. On a higher setup, because your center of mass is further from the axle, gravity has more leverage when you lean. So the board naturally wants to drop into the turn. On a lower setup, that effect is much smaller. You have to do more of the work yourself. So this is exactly where that ankle work comes from. Now this doesn't mean the lower setup can't pump well. Modern setups can compensate for ride height, and part of that comes from the bushings, how they store and return energy. But ride height still changes how easy that response is to access. So what's the takeaway here? I'll be the first to admit, on a real-world setup, these changes are almost immeasurable. We aren't seeing the massive swings or the dramatic dives on this lab setup. And in reality, when we are tuning these boards, we are fighting for millimeters. On the table, a small riser or slightly deeper concave might not seem like much. But in LDP, it's a game of cumulative gains. When you're out on a long ride, that tiny bit of extra rebound adds up over thousands and thousands of pumps. If you've been feeling like your setup needs a lot of ankle work, it might not just be your bushings. It might be your geometry height. Because at the end of the day, ride height isn't just about numbers. It's about how your movement gets translated. Try playing around with it on your next ride and let the geometry do the work, so your legs don't have to. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Happy skating!